Welcome, everybody. And you can see the chat box, Danielle?
Yep.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the responsive webinar. We'll wait about another minute or two before we begin. If you have any questions or comments to share, you can, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A folder, and you can type those in. There's also a chat box where we will exhibit some information. And okay, we're going to begin. I'm Glenn Marks of 180 Circle, and I'm delighted today to introduce to everybody Danielle Bowers from Google. And Danielle, I'm just going to jump in and let you talk a little bit about your work with Google. I am guessing that not everybody is familiar with how spread out Google offices are throughout the world. And so if you can just provide us a little bit of an overview of your history with Google and what you're working on now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I'm Danielle Bowers. I have been at Google since 2011. And I joined the organization in our sales org as a data analyst consultant, working with our publishers to try to advance their businesses using Google's properties. And it was around that time when I was starting to just feel that I wanted to start to see what was out there. And the great thing about Google is you can really bounce around everywhere. As Glenn said, we have offices in almost any country, and there are a million different things that you can get involved with. And so I moved over into Google Plus, and that was when we thought that Google Plus was going to be a thing. Obviously, that did not turn out to be the case, but it was an interesting experiment to get to learn actually about a new leader that I felt very inspired by the name of Steve Grove, who shortly after that asked me to help start a new team at the company called the News Lab. And that was about 4.5 years ago. And it was really our attempt to try to represent the voice of journalists inside the company and focus on helping journalists leverage Google's technology and platform to produce the highest quality content that they can. And I think over the last 4.5 years, there's been a lot of different chapters to that story. But, I took on a number of roles, as anyone in a startup type environment does, from relaunching Google Trends as a product manager to taking on a partnerships role in DC for 2016, which I can share more about because that was a fascinating project, to starting a research and development effort that really tried to get at how misinformation was being created online and how we could think about starting to combat that. And what I realized through that project was a collaboration is really at the heart of how we were going to effectively come together to solve that challenge. And it will and continue to be an ongoing challenge that all of the tech platforms are challenged by. But I think that was my inspiration to move to HR, which is where I currently am right now. I think I realized that we need to think about the people behind the problem in order to solve the problem itself. And so I found a role in HR that is looking at building a multi-year strategy for how we can more effectively use our people to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish in the business. And once I got here, I realized that it is an extremely complex challenge, but there are many facets that are fascinating to me now, and I'm excited to be here today to chat through some of them.
To put all of this in perspective, You are working in a small division in San Francisco.
Yes.
And I assume the technological parts, everything that most people think about Google, the search engines and all of their products and services, those are distributed throughout the globe?
Yep. So we use what we call GVC, Google Video Conferencing, to communicate across the globe to all of our different offices. I think there's a lot of different dimensions when you're talking about using technology across multiple time zones with multiple different cultures to help people share information, but also to truly connect on what work we're trying to accomplish. And the challenge there is making sure that people do have that common identity to work towards solving something. And that's where at Google we obsess over our culture and creating norms and ways of working that establish that commonality so that people can work together to accomplish something regardless of where they are in the world.
Okay. And we're going to eventually move into talking about collaboration. But before we get there, I still want to, for the benefit of people listening in that aren't intimately familiar with Google, Google has what, over 100,000 employees now? Is that accurate?
Yes, we have just over 100,000 full-time employees.
And last I was aware of, there were 843 separate businesses within Google.
Yes, and now we have Alphabet, which is focusing on a lot of those more pie in the sky, moonshot ideas that we have, where Google has really become the bread and butter of what people have historically known us to be. So that's where search sits. But then we also have YouTube and many others. So while our portfolio has expanded greatly, I think the way we think about what types of projects to take on still very much so tries to be in alignment with our mission, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. I think one way of thinking about that mission is that we can continue to have impact on the world and create positive change. So that's sort of how we think about the types of projects that we take on now.
And I want to make a disclaimer before we go further that you are not speaking as the voice of Google. You are offering your perspectives and from your experience in the work that you're engaged in. So how does Google take 100,000 employees, 843 businesses, and create a unified culture? Most organizations have a hard time doing that with 30 people.
That is true. And I said when I first joined this place that culture feels like a massive boulder that you're moving in one direction, and through inertia, it continues to go through that direction. And once it's going, it's really hard to get it to start going another direction. And so I think the founders did a really good job of setting up sort of the norms and ways of working since we were born. And that was created through things like free food, where I really believe in having people sit down over a meal to connect as humans, not just about the work, but about their way of working too. Through things like our peer bonuses, where we can give people a $50 bonus because they helped out on something that they didn't have to. It wasn't part of their core role. Reinforces that that way of being with each other where you go above and beyond. You'll see Googlers a lot of times opening doors for each other when they're walking through. And so in the way too that they design the offices, I mean, any country you go to, there will be unique elements of the office that are specific to that country or that local culture, which is always fun for Googlers who are coming from other offices going to another office. But there is definitely a consistency in what you can expect. So me, for example, going to London, I still feel like it's my office and my home. I don't feel like I'm walking into a foreign place. So that creates, again, a smaller sense of community, even though the company is so large.
And if somebody is either coaching an executive team or they are running their own company and want to build a more cohesive culture, you have described a lot of what I'm going to call the icing, the nice perks, the free food, that you can bring your laundry to work. There has to be something beyond that, from something that people resonate with from day one. What might you suggest to people, and what have you observed that works for Google?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll speak to it through the lens of the News Lab, which started as a very small organization and something that, I know we'll get to, I've sort of started to apply to an outside company that I recently started. But in the beginning, I think it's very important to establish a common vision that everyone has contributed to. So we sat down and we do a visioning session where everyone is getting out on the board what they would like to accomplish. So everyone really gets behind this inspiring future state. And then we started to develop what do we stand for? What are our values? What are our beliefs? What do we want to commit to in each other? Not too dissimilar from a marriage when you say your vows, but you're saying, hey, I am going to get into the trenches with you. Here is what I want to live by, and here's what I am promising in my work with you from a values standpoint. So once everyone is on board with that, it's a bit easier to sort of start to discuss what your norms are. So, we had conversations because we had someone in Singapore, another person in Europe, another person in Latin America, and they're all different time zones. So even the smallest thing like emailing in the middle of someone's day in Singapore is going to feel intrusive to someone out here because it could be the middle of the day. Or even if you are all in one city, is it okay to ping or to call or to text at 8 p.m. at night? Or is that going to be received as highly disrespectful because that is someone's family time? So, and even just your way of communicating. Do people prefer email? Do they prefer text? Do they prefer phone calls? Can all be misinterpreted if not explicitly stated in the beginning. So on this News Lab team, what we had decided was that we were going to have, because the team was not located in the same city, that we would have a chat that was just always open. For us, it was Google Chat, but others use Slack or other avenues. And that chat was to be used to share photos or funny things or memes or whatever it might be. And anything serious needed to be in an email, especially because we were distributed. Like, do not call me, do not text me, because who knows what hour that is. And my phone is much more personal, was the norm that we had set on our team. And that helped to develop a sense of relationship that wasn't always about work, but still got work done through the norm that we had created with our emails.
And you talk about the visioning and the working together in teams to come up with some agreements. Are these small teams, or what's the largest? What are the ranges of sizes from smaller to large? How big can the team be and this still work?
Yeah, so the News Lab started with just 5 people. We grew to 18 over the course of 2 years. And the team that I'm on currently, we had a visioning session and we were a little bit larger. I started with 12, and everyone was in the room in those circumstances. I think if it's a bit larger, there needs to be a smaller group that comes together, because otherwise it will just get unruly. And usually that group that comes together is the leadership team. But it's shared, it's communicated, it uses surveys, it helps reflect back to the company what the company is sharing. So there are multiple ways to gather intel from how your people are feeling. One is an annual survey. Others are focus groups. I mean, you can have this dialogue. And then whatever group sits down, it's important that when it's communicated back, it's communicated, here's what we've heard. This is our stab at a first draft to where we want to go, or whatever. Those details do matter in terms of how you phrase it. And so it should be phrased in the right way for the right size and that specific company.
And then in terms of communicating, so you have a group, maybe 15 people. So there have to be 12,000 of those throughout Google. In the previous webinar, I was speaking with Brian Robertson of Holacracy, and in their system, they take circles, which is synonymous to groups to some degree. It's different. And then there's always a representative from one circle that goes into the larger circles. How does Google keep the cohesiveness? So your team comes up, you come up with a visioning of recreating HR. How do you get buy-in with the other 99,888 people?
Oh, isn't that the silver bullet question? I think that is hard. And as organizations grow and evolve, and even just within different departments, you have different cultures and different ways of accomplishing that. Right now within HR, we're going through a massive transformation, and it's not something that I believe is specific to Google. I think HR in general as an industry has been going through this transformation for 10 plus years, but it feels like within our organization, we're starting to make a little bit more headway. The way that we have attempted to do it initially is through a bottoms up approach. And excuse me, the lights in my room just went off. And that can get unruly very, very quickly. But we used it to gather intel. And then a small collection of people came together. It was a representative from each of the major organizations. So you have the performance management VP, you have the whoever is thinking about job architecture, you have learning and development, you have staffing, you have people analytics, you have someone from every group so that all perspectives feel represented. And then that group is empowered to collectively decide and design the path forward. The leadership group is involved as what we call a steering committee, to help make decisions, to provide feedback and guidance, as is different business leaders. But ultimately, it is this cross-functional collection of leaders within our HR department that is putting their perspectives together on paper. That is the first time that we've started to make a lot of progress. And once the design phase is complete, then we would move into an implementation phase. And the implementation phase has to be, designed entirely differently from the design stage. And so thinking about that through a change management standpoint and all the communication that would have to happen and the rollout of that. So that's how we've done it, and making sure that everyone's voices feel heard, and that you're not missing key perspectives in the development of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish.
Am I correct that Google is essentially, in large part because it's grown so magnificently and in large part because everything changes so quickly, is Google constantly reinventing its culture and reinventing itself? Is that, in your opinion, the future of work?
That is so interesting that you say that. I think, one of the most important things that that we've been reminded of recently is that this isn't the first time. We've been here before, and we will continue to be in a position where we're feeling like something needs to change. I mean, it's just the nature of being in an innovative company. I will say that focusing on and obsessing over your culture is the right place to focus attention, because culture is everything when you're talking about people. And so, yes, like we will continue to change and obsess over the culture and iterate in our current state. And I also, if you believe that people all evolve and change, or then organizations inherently do as well, and having the awareness to know how your people are changing, and tomorrow what type of work flexibility they might require, what are the new demands on them from a family standpoint, what new skills are they going to need, and constantly just iterating over that is what I think is necessary to stay and remain successful.
And you and I were engaged in a conversation with some other folks yesterday around the topic of the anxiety sometimes that comes up when there's change initiatives. What is in your work, and what have you seen Google do to help people adapt to the fact that the job they got hired for 2 years ago doesn't exist anymore? The job that they're doing now. Many people are being asked to create AI, so their job isn't needed. What's Google doing to manage and to cultivate people being very flexible, resilient, people being able to adapt quickly with all the
Yeah.
change?
Yeah. I think that's two-part. I think one, it's the expectations that you set when you bring people in. So through the hiring process, people should be aware that you are hiring them as an employee for the company, not for necessarily a specific role. So we have multiple interviews and are looking for a specific type of person that can be successful at Google. So it shouldn't just be the current project that's on their plate, but that once that project is complete, that you can see them moving around the organization and being effective doing so. And that alone places the value of that individual on the person over the work. So it's easier for people to not associate their identity to what they do, but rather who they are. And if employees are able to establish that sense of worth, then as the work changes, they have less skin in the game on what they're doing, because they know that the company will continue to give them work that matters, that's aligned with what they want to be doing and that's meaningful for them. And if not, if there isn't a role that's open that fits both what the person wants to do, what they're great at, then that's the time you have the conversation of either let's move to another organization or maybe it's time to find you a role outside of the company. But I think that's what we're currently thinking about is internal mobility, moving not just within the organization, but in and outside of the organization and being okay with that.
Do you have any idea what the turnover rate is?
Not off the top of my head.
I mean, you're describing something that I think a lot of companies would love to have, which is many opportunities within the organization for people to move. If they're just hired for one thing and they're just not a good fit, but they're really talented somewhere else, if you can move them. A lot of mid-sized companies have a harder time with that because people get hired for pivotal roles.
Yes, and that was the second point that I was going to make, which is the learning and development. So Google has doubled down within our HR department on establishing a pretty large learning and development organization, using employees to teach other employees, but also creating experiences that can start to develop skill sets in other ways. So maybe it's not as obvious that someone in a middle-sized company would be a great fit for a specific project. It might be obvious that someone else who has done it 1,000 times over is a good fit, but it might be better for the longer term mobility of the organization to give someone an opportunity to grow into that and give the other person who's done it 1,000 times an opportunity to do something else. And that doesn't mean that their whole role is changing, but it might be a specific project that you can start to give people an opportunity to develop new things so that they don't get so rooted in, oh, I've only ever done this, I can only ever do this, but rather moving towards that growth mindset of taking on new experiences and saying, actually, I can do other things and my worth isn't associated with just what I've been doing for the last 10 years.
And presumably this cross-training and opportunities is self-selecting. People can choose, gee, I'd love to learn about programming, and they can learn about that or some other capacity.
I think that depends on the organization and the bandwidth of individuals. I think desire, we were talking yesterday about desire to learn and creating the time and space to do that. There probably will be individuals that will be more willing, but how do you infuse those experiences into your performance management system so that people want to take those on? Say, in order to get to this next level, we need to see you go through X, Y, Z experiences, and we'll support you along the way with different learning initiatives. So then those learning initiatives have a purpose and they have an outcome that they're trying to get to, as opposed to just spending this extra time learning this extra thing. And I don't see how that's going to benefit me in the long run.
You were talking with me offline a little earlier about visioning the future of HR. Anything you can reveal that's not proprietary at this point about some of the ideas being kicked around?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are things, as I mentioned before, HR as an industry is going through a massive overhaul. And so, as I've talked to colleagues outside of Google, it seems to me that there are three clear buckets that are sort of challenges everyone's facing. And the first one being collaboration. How, as a tech company who was born and raised in a world where products were the single focus of what they offered, so you have the search team and you have the YouTube team and you have the news team. How do you get them to start working across each other when you have new products like the assistant that needs to be infused across everything? So it's and also just going from a small company to a very large company very quickly. You again obsessing over the culture because you're bringing in a lot of new individuals and having to reestablish what that culture is. All of these things affect an organization's ability to collaborate. So I think collaboration is one thing that we're solving for and will continue to solve for as we grow. Culture is the second bit. So what is important to us? What's part of our DNA that we've been that we grew up with that has helped us be very successful, and how do we maintain those components but in our new reality, which is that we are a large organization. And then the last one is around priorities. So as you get bigger, and especially in a company like Google, who has had this 20% idea, where ideas can come from anywhere, and that's how you have 7 billion user products, and that's how you experiment and generate these new innovative things. At a certain point, how do you make sure that all of your people are working towards a common priority? And so thinking through our current, we call it an OKR system, which is setting objectives and key results, being very clear about what we're doing. How do we use our goal setting mechanism to, in our new size or growing size, I should say, to make sure that everyone is very aware and clear on the priorities and how they're contributing to a larger system?
Let's move into collaboration. It seems to be a popular trend that has amazing potential and some real dark sides to it. And one of the things that I want to just, and I know you didn't set this system up, so I want to be fair to you. But a question that I have is, Google is a meritocracy. So people get promoted, people get raises based on individual performance. And then you're asking people to collaborate. It seems like there's going to be a little built-in tension there. Does that happen?
Yeah, I think, collaboration is multifaceted. It's not just the reward system that inspires people to collaborate. It's much more than that. You have the cultural element of it. So the peer bonuses and the coffee shops on campus, the things that require or that inspire people to come together to collaborate, and spot bonuses that tend to award teams. So there's a lot of other things in the system aside from our formal review process that will create that culture of collaboration. But I think structure is another piece. So as the organization is growing, continually thinking about challenging ourselves, do we have the right structure in place? Is information flowing in a way that makes it easy for people to get what they need to know in order to accomplish this thing collectively? And there are a lot of ways in which you can structure an organization, but the idea of dotted line reports or creating cross-functional working groups or taking people off, full-time roles for a minute and putting them on a temporary project. Those are all ways to think about the structure so that it inspires collaboration. But yes, then you do have your incentive and reward system. And I think a lot of organizations, not just like Google, are really starting to think about rewards in terms of what and also how. So, what they're accomplishing, yes, individually, they need to accomplish whatever goals were set for them, but that those goals are in service of a broader team mission, and are not just specific to that individual. So, by rewarding the individual, you're essentially rewarding a component of the system. And then the how bit talks about how people should behave. So that says, as a leader, for example, one of your behavioral expectations might be that you need to lift your people, that you should not be able to get promoted until you have a successor identified, which means you're inherently growing those beneath you. And then I think the third bucket is really around leadership. So is the leader setting a vision that's clear enough? Are they able to inspire an organization? Can they set the right structure? Can they deal with ambiguity? How secure do they make their teams feel in being able to accomplish this vision? What empowerment is in place? What level of decisions can managers make? What level of autonomy do individual contributors have? All of these things, I think a leader is now being expected to do, especially the more complex the business becomes.
One complaint of a lot of people in organizations that are called to be part of collaborative teams is they get spread too thin. They're talented, so marketing wants them. Engineering wants them, sales wants them. Can people say no in Google without repercussions? Can they just go, sorry, not me?
Yeah. And I think no is important. No is just as important as yes, because if the priorities are clear, you should know when to say no. And I think it's also important when the leader is setting the objectives for the organization that the objectives are not just set for what each individual business unit or each individual team needs to accomplish, but rather the intersection points are also taken into consideration. So if two teams are going to need to collaborate, they should have whatever that intersection point goal is. However, that should be an explicit objective. So that those teams, that is a priority for them to work together. And if it's not, then say, hey, maybe we should revisit this next time we're setting goals. It's not a priority for us this quarter.
What would you recommend to either people in Google or people in other organizations as some red flags that collaboration isn't working?
Yeah. So this is from my personal experience of when I decided to make the jump to HR. If decision-making is very difficult, then something is off. I think there's a point at which, you have too many representatives from different groups, and it's very hard to make a decision, and a decision, sometimes a decision maker needs to be identified as the decision maker, and that can help with collaboration. I think also if you have multiple people or multiple teams trying to solve the same problem, you might have a collaboration challenge. So one example of this is actually, we've been really talking across multiple different departments about the three respects, which are Google's values at the highest level. So respect the user, respect the opportunity, respect each other. How do those then get applied at the individual levels? And the leaders at that next layer weren't explicitly, for my organization, setting what those were. And so you had all the teams creating their own versions of it. And that's when you realize, actually, we need to come together and design what these look like for all of us. The last thing I'll say is meetings. I know these can be, there's either too many on the calendar, you are having to meet with everyone and anyone under the sun just to make one decision. That's an issue and a lot of time wasted. Or the opposite, where there's no meetings at all. The teams are so frustrated with each other, or the dynamics are such so to where they refuse to even talk. And I think those two are signals. And for organizations that use calendar technology, like there's a network analysis that you can do where you're looking at like what teams are actually talking to each other and how is that going. And it's a good way to assess where you might have some challenges.
And there is a bias. So if I'm a CEO and I've got 500 person company or 2,000 person company, fairly small company, and I go and I talk to team leaders and I go, how's it going? You know what the response is going to be. It's going to be great. I mean, Google has these very sophisticated analytics. And it sounds to me that the team leads have a huge amount of autonomy to self-correct as they're going on. Are there other ways to get past people's biases to say things are going well, people's hesitancy to admit that things aren't working well or they don't know how to really solve a problem?
Yes. One of the important things I think when we're setting objectives is to be very explicit around what success looks like and the key results that you're trying to drive. So both from the work, and oftentimes you'll notice if things aren't going great, different signals will show up in those key results that can help you identify what's going on. But I also think it's really important to have a pulse of your team, of the people in the organization, more on the qualitative aspects, how they're feeling about things, what ideas they might have, how they're feeling about their leadership, because leaders can't ignore that. And so we use an annual survey that has become a major part in which our leaders assess how they're doing and then in response can make changes within an organization. So I would say the more data that you can collect and the more specific you can be on success, the better.
Okay. And leaders, we all know, come in all sizes and shapes and different levels, different personalities, different levels of self-development. In terms of building healthier collaborative teams, how important do you think a leader's self-awareness and self-development is?
My personal opinion is that it's everything. I think, especially in today's complexity, having a leader who can not only assess what's going on for themselves and understand why they might be reacting a certain way, but then use that mental complexity and understanding to be able to actually see another person. Because I believe that until a leader can fully understand what perspective they have, they're not going to be able to understand the perspective of their team or others. There's a really interesting framework to think about this idea of mental complexity, where as adults, we have 3 different mindsets. The first one being the socialized mind, where you take stimulus and you simply respond to it. The second one being a self-authoring mind, where you can assess using your own perspective. And the third being this, what I would say, the highest emotional intelligence, self-transformative mind, where a leader can understand their own perspective and then all of those around them and come from the most valuable perspective. And there was a research study done that interviewed 100 Fortune 500 CEOs, and only 6 of them had this third mindset. And I think that's going to become more and more critical as the world becomes more complex, as technology continues to evolve, as we have more and more information at our disposal, to come back to the thing at the end of the day that most people are driven by, which is connection. And if you can create those genuine, authentic connections at work, our work is going to become more meaningful and more valuable. But if a leader doesn't inspire that type of culture or create space for that type of connection, you're not going to have the type of intrinsic motivation that I think a lot of organizations are after right now.
So if only 6% of leaders of Fortune 500 have mastered or consistently demonstrate this social intelligence, this different mindset. Sounds like there's a huge amount of room for growth and improvement. You've done some work both within Google and outside of Google to help facilitate the process of developing social intelligence. You want to talk about that a little bit and how you see that plays out in terms of collaboration and healthier workplaces?
Yeah, definitely. Um, so I think the first thing within Google, I've started to teach a course that I've called Finding Your Stride, and it's really around helping people unpack the ways of making meaning around them. So, anything that happens, you often will jump to a conclusion, and being able to seek other alternatives and other ways of thinking about whatever it was that happened, I think starts to get us out of ourselves and into another person. But I think even getting to a stage where someone is open or willing to go on that journey is really hard. And for me personally, I found that openness, and for myself, it sort of unlocked the ability to start diving deeper was by working with horses. And I think, especially in Silicon Valley, it's really an amazing opportunity to get out of the office and get into a barn with some horses and completely change your environment. And start to work with horses to develop emotional intelligence. And that is a company that I recently created called Core Connection. And the goal of Core Connection is to go through a series of activities with people and horses to help them objectively see how they're showing up in the world. Horses mirror our energy, so they will often respond in a way that reflects whatever it is we're feeling. And they also read congruence. So if someone's intention and the energy around that intention and the behavior that shows up as a result of that intention are all in alignment, then the horse will actually respond or follow or do whatever it is that the person is trying to get them to do. If any one of those things is off, they won't. And so we equate this to authentic leadership. Humans are not too far off from that. We often have suspicion, like, why is a leader doing that? If people are starting to question your underlying motives, like that is because they're incongruent. And so through this type of work, you can try new things. You can question yourself if a horse doesn't decide to follow you, for example. Why did that happen? And then you can try something different immediately 5 minutes later. And you don't have to worry about what the horse is thinking and if they're judging you and what are they bringing to the table. It's a much easier space to experiment in. And we are finding some really early success with people coming through a program. And I'm feeling very hopeful and excited about it.
And do you think it generalizes? Is that what you mean when you say early success? They go back and they get rated by their peers as being more effective leaders?
So I think what happens is you start to open people up. And so I've had some people follow up with me afterwards to ask more questions. And that's really the point of it, is getting someone open and willing. Because once someone is open and willing, there are many forms of development, coaching, that will start to become a lot more effective. But getting someone to that point is the hardest part in my perspective.
And the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I mean, Google has to have all these things available to people, and yet it is still a self-selective group.
Exactly. Yes.
And who knows how much more amazing Google could be if everybody went through some form of transformative process.
Yeah. And it's hard. This is not easy.
You think?
Yeah. And it's a risk both for the individual and for the organization, because someone who goes on this journey might come out thinking that they're in the wrong role or they're in the wrong company. Who knows? But at the end of the day, a transformed person who's more capable of connecting and inspiring their people is going to be more effective regardless of where they are or what role they're in. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about caring about people, not what they're doing. And I hope that we as a collective society can get to that place. It would make a lot of things a lot more enjoyable.
This is all pretty amazing stuff. I want to switch gears for a moment. I just want to mention, for those of you who are watching the chat, I've put at the bottom Danielle's contact number if people, email, I'm sorry, if people want to approach you. And there's also Core Connection. EQ is your work with the equine. There's my contact information. Want to encourage people listening to consider coming to the Responsive Conference at Zappos headquarters in September. I went to the first one last year, and Robin Zander and his team do a remarkable job of making this very accessible for communicating with people, for networking, through exchanging ideas. At this point in my life, I typically go to conferences for the people and not so much the content, and it's brilliantly done. I have a rhetorical question since I can't get responses from people. But probably that I have been talking, people have checked their computers, people have checked their emails, people have checked their phones. Imagine for a moment how challenging it would be to go even a couple of hours without your electronics while you're awake. So take that a step further and imagine never having had access to the internet, not knowing. I met through Danielle through some mutual work we were doing with the nonprofit that she's engaged with, and I want to switch to talking about that for a few minutes. This is an area that's working with nonprofits is an area that's very dear to my heart. You want to talk about Community Tech Network for a minute or two and how you see sort of bringing a balance to your life? And
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best thing about the Community Tech Network is that they are focused on increasing digital literacy with those who don't have access, the elderly, the underserved communities, schools, and really making sure that everyone has access to information. I think we don't always realize how many people are getting left behind because they simply can't apply to a job online, or they can't respond to a family member or reach out to anyone because they don't have a phone. I think in the Bay Area, this shows up a lot with the homeless population, and a lot of those who are getting displaced. And so I'm really inspired by the work that the Community Tech Network is doing, and it would encourage anyone who's interested to volunteer. We have a lot of different programs, and volunteers are definitely needed.
And can you say a little bit more about the day-to-day work? Like CTN, Community Tech Network, I've put the link up there on the chat room.
Yeah. So on a regular basis, they are partnering with different organizations to train individuals on using technologies. We have many different programs. That's probably the best way to summarize all of them. So one is working with elderly. So we have volunteers who will go into homes and help them learn how to use a laptop. Different tech companies will donate devices and help individuals get access to the internet. And there was another program that was going for many years. That one was I personally really inspired by, called Ready, Set, Connect, where we trained a bunch of students who were coming from underprivileged neighborhoods and exposed them to different leaders and tech organizations around how to do anything from creating a website to Um, building a LinkedIn profile to using their email. And then they would go into libraries and teach elderly in the library. So it was a good way for them to practice their own leadership and confidence and re-solidify what they had learned. But there are new programs popping up within CTN all the time, depending on what the needs are. And the organization is really trying to figure out how we can remain nimble and really serve the needs of today.
And somebody has asked if there's an organization that similar to this that acts nationwide. CTN has offices in Austin and San Francisco. I'm not aware of a national organization. Are you?
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of a national organization that focuses on this same issue. I think, unfortunately, digital literacy is not something that most people recognize as the driver behind a lot of the other issues that we have. So, homelessness, for example, or different challenges that we have with the elderly. I think we have a lot of programs that address sort of the symptom and not the cause, where I think CTN is unique in that it's really trying to address a cause of a lot of other things.
Okay, some people are not seeing the links that I set, so let me go through them again. Core Connections did not come up on Google, so is there another search engine? Your company can't even promote your work. You have to go to those engineers and tell them to get their act together here.
So our website just launched last week, so we haven't had much time yet to be seen by the algorithm. But if you search Core Connection Equine Coaching in Google, it will be one of the first links.
All right, excellent. And I just want to put in my 2 cents worth for, I'm a big believer in helping nonprofits and the amazing amount of wealth we have in the world today, and certainly in the United States, there's still many people that are not receiving services. And you can either get involved with a board. I've worked with a number of nonprofits that are always looking for board members. And there are a couple of clearinghouses. I guess Board Search is one of them. You could just do a Google search or a search engine. And often a lot of organizations need people for just projects, certain levels of expertise. So if you have see people doing some amazing work, just call up and ask to talk to the executive director and just see if maybe you've only got a few hours to help with the project, but everything is appreciated. So Danielle, thanks so much for your time. Do you have any 2 or 3 take-home messages for people that don't have the ability to work for an organization as visionary as Google, but in terms of just repeating a couple take-home messages on how important the culture is, what you might suggest if I came up to you in a coffee shop and say, hey, I'm struggling getting my culture clear in my organization, or I'm struggling getting everybody coalesced around a common vision, a couple of take-home messages from all of your work?
Yeah, I think the best way to summarize sort of the discussion today is probably to think about really 3 things to really pay attention to. The first one is obviously collaboration around how information flows within your organization, what the power structure is and how decisions actually get made, and if people are set up for success in terms of their structure that they're placed in. I think the second bit that will and should continue to be, no matter how big or small an organization is the culture. And everyone has a different definition of culture. I think making sure that people are able to connect again as humans is one of the most important things, and setting up the right incentives to reinforce that way of behaving within your organization, but also being as explicit as possible around what's okay and what's not okay, and how people want to work, and asking people how they want to work is really going to help establish a culture where miscommunication or things are not happening. And then the last is the priorities. I think as leaders, it's critical in today's environment to make sure that you're being super clear about your vision and that that vision is inspiring, but then you have clear priorities that are very obvious how you're going to get to that vision for everyone in the organization. The murkier it gets, the harder the other things become. So I think with those three things, you'll start to at least develop a foundation that will set you up for success.
Uh, Amazing how just being clear sort of opens up the path for a lot of people. And I think that's where many organizations and leaders struggle. I gave the wrong URL for Community Tech, and it's actually spelled out Community Tech Network. I've put that up in the chat. If anybody has some questions, Rana, you had asked about not seeing the suggested details. I'm not following your questions, so feel free to email me offline and I will help you get to whatever information you're looking for. It's Glenn, Glenn at 180, the number's 180circle.com. Thank you very much. Our next webinar will be in a couple of weeks, and we will be interviewing Chris Fussell, who is part of the McChrystal Group and co-author on the book, Team of Teams. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.